All right, one more time, just in case you didn't catch that, John Jr. has the handout of the rules for parenting. If you missed that, make sure he sees you. Dennis has questions on Matthew 1 and 2 for next time. We have some ground to cover, so we're going to get underway. This is the last of our studies on parenting. We're talking about communication with children. Have a good deal of things we want to talk about, and we'll get to that here in a moment. Now, the handout that you just received on rules for parenting, some of you have asked for that, and thus we provide that to you. These are all the rules we dealt with all through the class, including what we're about to see in a moment. But some of you may want that in electronic form, so if you want that, and I'm going to mention one other thing that you have access to, if you go to our website, look for the Bible class schedule, click there, and that'll take you to this page. And this information right here on the top two things are about to go away here soon. So if you want to access the material on parenting, click there and you'll go to this page. Now there are two things that you want to pay attention to there. One is these parenting rules if you want it in electronic form. To save that, click there. That's going to go away soon. So get that today if you can, or in the next week. Then there is this book that we've referred to several times. It's in PDF. It's not in print anymore. If you haven't accessed that and you want that, then you need to access that soon, within the next week. That's going away soon. So those two things are available if you want those. So let's go to our rule, number 22, which is the last one on your sheet, and the last one we'll be giving in this class. Make time every day for playtime and Bible time. Would you agree with that? Particularly for young kids, where this obviously isn't dealing with college-age kids still at home, but would you agree with that? Make time every day for your young kids for playtime and Bible time, that you have some time with them. You spend some time doing something. It may seem like it's trivial to be playing Barbies with the little girl, or playing trucks with the little boy, or pitching the ball, and that seems to be so trivial when you have so much to do. But that's very much an important thing for those young kids. Make time for playtime every day and make time for Bible time. It may be nothing but reading a Bible story from a simple Bible story book to begin with. It may then increase to having preparation for the Bible class. But if you have every day for a little Bible time and every day for some playtime, it will pay off in the long run. I'll guarantee it. Guarantee that it will. Make sense? All right, that's the last rule we're considering. We're talking about communication with children. And so this is not in the workbook. We've left the workbook 2 weeks ago that we have been looking at, which is pictured there. But let's start with this principle that any and every relationship that you have is only as good as the communication between the parties involved. Would you agree? That's true in marriage, that's true in business, and that's true in the church. You take a marriage, and if it's very poor communication, that marriage is only as good as the communication is. Same thing in business. Suppose you go in business, halfers in a business with some business partner, and you can't communicate too well, and you're not communicating. That business is only as good as your communication between each other. Same thing is true in a church. So communication with children is demanded and implied by a number of Bible principles. And you say, where is the passage that says parents need to communicate with children? Well, if you're looking for that quotation, you won't find that anywhere. But what you will find is any passage on training and teaching implies that there has to be communication. How can you train a child in the way they should go without communicating? How can you bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord without communicating? How can you give them instruction as well as discipline without communicating? You can't. The golden rule would imply that you treat others the way you want to be treated. And so do you want your child to communicate with you? You say, well, sure I do. Well, then you need to be able to communicate with them. And we'll talk about those skills here in just a moment. The principle of love would imply that. And so how could you love your mate, for example, but we don't ever communicate? We don't talk. We just don't have any communication. Oh, we live in the same house, but we really love it. No, you don't. There's something missing. Same thing with parent-child relationship. Same principle that's involved. So we're going to look at four things. We have some ground to cover, and we'll spend the bulk of our time, hopefully, in point 4, but we've got to establish some groundwork before we get there. So let's start with this. Just what is communication? How would you define communication? All right. The transfer of ideas and concepts from one person to another. Very good. Listening is involved. Let's begin with this concept. The English word communicate is a biblical term, but it's found very few places. In other words, it's not like the word faith or the word grace, which you find you just open your Bible and you just about find the word faith or believe in nearly any text. That's kind of an overstatement for emphasis, but the word communicate is found, for example, in Galatians 2 and in verse 2. Now, there's different words, so let's go to Galatians 2 and verse 2. I just want to get the concept of why the translators use the word communicate in some translations. Your translation may use a different word, but in Galatians 2 and in verse 2, Paul said he went up to Jerusalem by revelation and communicated to them the gospel. That word simply means, it's translated communicate, and you may have a different word in your translation, means to declare or to make clear. He went to Jerusalem and made clear some things. He declared what he was teaching. And so, why is the word communicate used here? Well, if you're going to communicate with your children, you need to declare, you need to make some things clear to your children. If you're trying to instruct your child, lead them in a way, and it's not clear, you're not communicating too well. Make sense? All right, there's another word that's used. And this one's fascinating to me. Let's turn to 1 Timothy 6:19. Now, you turn over there and you say, I don't see the word communicate. Well, the American Standard does use the word communicate. And this is talking about giving advice and instruction to those who are rich. And in verse 18, let them do good, that they may be rich in good works, ready to give, willing, my translation says, New King James, share. The American Standard uses this word communicate. All right, what's interesting about that is that's a word that has the same root word. I'm starting at the bottom line, then I'll come back to the line before that. It comes from the same root word as koinonia. You say, I've heard that before. That's the word for fellowship. It's not the same word, but it's the same root word. Has the same root word for the word koinonia, fellowship. The word means to share. That's what I'm interested in. It means to have something in common. So if you're communicating with your child, you're sharing with your child. If your child is communicating with you, they're sharing with you. You have something in common. Now, if there's not communication, and you say, well, my child has grown up and we just don't ever talk, and there is no communication, you don't have anything in common anymore. Make sense? You don't have anything in common anymore. Now, what's interesting about that word koinonia being the same root word, it involves the idea of sharing something in common. It also involves this idea of giving and receiving. That same word koinonia is used in Philippians 4. Paul said, no church communicated with me, there's our word, concerning giving and receiving. Talking about them giving them financial support. So it involved someone giving and some receiving. So if you give information, the information is received, you have communication. If you give information, you receive information back, there is communication. Make sense? All right, we're just trying to get to the basics of communication. It's the same concept of communion. Same word, koinonia, used there. Same root word as we find in our text in 1 Timothy 6. So when we are communing together, we share something in common. And so we're communing together. What communion does righteousness have with unrighteousness? That was the question raised in 2 Corinthians 6. We have no communion. We have nothing in common with the world. So you want to have something in common with your child, communication. I'm trying to drive at the basic concept. Now, communication involves far more than talking. Would you agree with that? Far more than talking. Evidence, you say? Well, look at the unhappy marriages that are abundant. There's maybe a lot of talking going on, but they're not communicating. Children that are distant from their parents. I don't mean by miles. I'm just talking about they're estranged from their parents. They are many, and consequently suggest that it's more than talking. Broken friendships, split churches, all suggest this idea. So parents who want to talk to their children, and they say, I talk to my children, but they have the idea of lecturing and commanding and criticizing their children, may not be communicating at all. Does that make sense? Now, you may not have experienced this. I've talked to some children rather, not parents, but children, grown children, who have told me that in their childhood growing up, that the parents would lecture, maybe they would holler, maybe they would, quote, preach to the children, rather than communicating with the children. So it involves far more than talk. You can talk to your children, but you may not be communicating. Does that make sense? All right. Now let's talk about how we communicate. How do we communicate? Say, I got what communication is. We need to share information, giving and receiving. I got that. So how do we communicate? Well, here's the most obvious way. We communicate with words. Does that make sense? See, that's how God communicates with us. Now, words are vehicles of thought. So if I have a thought that I want to give to my child, maybe it's instruction, maybe it's correction, then I have to put that in words sometimes, don't I? So it's a vehicle of thought. So if I want to know what my child is thinking, they've got to put in words how they're feeling, how they're thinking, and send that to me with that vehicle of thought. All right? Now, what's important about that, we need to be careful in choosing our words that we communicate the right and correct message. Why is that important? Let's broaden out and talk in general and come back then to children. Let's think of preaching the gospel. Is it important we choose the right word? Yeah. You have a preacher or a Bible class teacher that's very careless in choosing the right word. They send the wrong signal, the wrong message. We have to do cleanup work after that. Well, he didn't mean this, and we need to correct that. That's a disaster. We don't need that in preaching the gospel. Well, your child's soul may be at stake. So you need to make sure that I'm communicating correctly, giving the right signal, giving the right message. I want the child to understand clearly. Does that make sense? Hence the word that we saw in Galatians 2, to make clear. Children often take words literally that we're not using literally. And so we need to be careful that they understand that I don't mean that literally, but here's what I do mean. Make sense? All right. Now, the tone with which we speak is important. Someone read Proverbs 12 and in verse 18. We'll forego 15 and 1. I'll tell you what it says, that a soft answer turns away wrath. So sometimes the way I talk to the child, the tone, can calm the circumstance that otherwise may escalate. Proverbs 12:18. Someone have it? Let's get it quickly.
One who speaks rashly, like the thrust of the sword, the tongue of the wise brings healing.
All right. That's true of parenting. You can say something that's like cutting a sword right through the child's heart. Or you could deal with it in a way where you accomplish more good by the better tone that you have. Make sense? All right. Now, here's another way we communicate. By our actions. How do we communicate by our actions where maybe not a word is spoken? Body gestures, yeah. Okay. Gestures. Facial expressions. Our example. Do we not communicate by our example? Like mother, like daughter? Ezekiel 8:16-44. Be thou an example of the believer, Paul told Timothy. Does that include parents being an example to the children? Sure it does. Sure. So the example you're setting sets precedent and is communicating to your child. For example, you don't go to Bible class. Or you don't go to church half the time. You're communicating to your child, church is not important. You say, I never told him that. Yeah, you did. You communicated that by your example. All right, here's another way we communicate. Same principle, but nonverbal communication is very powerful. Let's look at two passages that'll help us with this. You say, I never told my child, thus and so is okay. I never told them that I approved. I never said but I might have communicated that through nonverbal communication. You tell me, 1 Peter 3, 1 and 2. What is the nonverbal communication in 1 Peter 3, verses 1 and 2?
The wife went and husband over through her conduct.
Yeah, not through her words. So she's not going to win him by, that he will not be won by the conversation, that they do not obey the word, but notice that they observe the chaste conduct, verse 2, accompanied by fear. In other words, he's not going to listen to what she says, but he's going to observe what she does. Powerful, powerful. 1 John 3:18, let us not love but in, not in word, in deed and in truth. In other words, we show our action rather than just talk about it. It's not about love. You don't just say, I love you to your brethren. You show it and you demonstrate. Nonverbal communication is the idea. So we might communicate by the look we give, the face that we make. We communicate by what we do for them, the time we spend with them. You spend time. We talked about playtime a moment ago and Bible time, and you always make time for your child. You don't have to say, I care about you. Now, you ought to, but that says, I care about you. Does that make sense? You're communicating non-verbally, I care about you. So we have communication by our actions. Would you agree with this, that we communicate by what we don't do and what we don't say? Yeah. One agrees with me, two of us, three of us, four of us. All right. Yes. By maybe ignoring the child. Or maybe by not answering or responding to the child. I once observed a father who repeatedly did this. I lived close by and in the same apartment complex where there was another Christian who had children, and I would overhear the child asking, can we go to the movie or go to the ball game or whatever, and they would ask and ask and ask and ask and ask and ask, and then finally he'd say, okay, you can go. It was too late for him to go. It was past time, and he deliberately did that. Provoked them to wrath. So maybe by not answering, or maybe by not making a comment or commendation. We just didn't say anything. The child did something and we didn't make any comment. We just communicated with them. Maybe not being at their game or their recital or their play that they were in. Sent a strong signal to the child. Or maybe by not asking them to go with us somewhere. Or maybe by not taking notice of things that they've done. They did something, they made changes, and we didn't take notice of that. That's communicating with the child too. Would you agree? Communication, vitally important. Now let's talk about that principle, and that is the value of good communication. What is the value? Let's just take two families to demonstrate our point. We have one family over here. They do not communicate well with their children. The children will admit it. The parents will admit it. But over here we have another family where communication is going quite well from early age all the way through till they're out from home. And what difference are the families going to have? What differences will the families have? What value is there in having this kind of family where communication started from the time they were born till they left home? Good communication between parents and children. Over here they didn't.
One thing, you have a good relationship. Your child can communicate with you. And the opposite other way, that your child, when they go out on their own, is not going to be there for you when you need them.
Yeah, it's going to have an impact on later life. I want to come back to that here in just a second. Trust. Is the child going to trust you from the early age till they're out from home?
There'll be a lot more love and respect as well.
Absolutely. All right, let's begin to list some. I cite Webb, and if you don't have that book, go take a look at that. I don't agree with everything she said. I think it's an overall good book. But look at page 272 if you want to take a look at that. Go download that. She talks about in the book that we immunize our children against emotional neglect by communication. And so I went back and read that again and read it again and then read it again to see if I'm missing something. And finally, I think I began to get the concept of what she's talking about. And I think she's correct about that. Emotional neglect is not as easily noticed as physical neglect. You don't feed your child. You're not bathing your child. it gets pretty noticeable pretty quick. But by emotional neglect, we're talking about the frustrations of the child, things that build up that disturb the child that goes unnoticed because you're not communicating. So the point here is that good communication creates an environment where the child feels like somebody cares about me and I can talk to them and share my problems with them. When there's not good communication, that goes unnoticed. Well, teaching the child becomes easier because of communication. Would you agree? Whether you're teaching them the basics of school, maybe you're homeschooling, or maybe you're teaching them God's Word, or you're teaching them good morals. See, good communication creates an environment for learning because you can communicate. You can talk to each other. You kind of know what's going on in the mind of the child. The child knows the thinking of the parent. All right, here's something else. It creates an atmosphere where correcting a wrong course becomes easier. You'll have to do that at some point. It may be early in their ages that you're trying to tell them that you don't play outside and you don't play with the plug. You don't stick something in the light socket. And it may be later you're telling them, we're not going to go with those friends. You say, well, that's kind of hard. You see, lecturing and hollering is not likely to get the job done. If you're hollering at your child and your communication is lecturing to your child, you're probably not going to get the job done. It's probably not going to work. But good communication creates this backdrop where the child is more likely to listen. Let's go to Proverbs 29:15. Someone get that for me and read it as soon as you get it. In interest of time here. All right, let's start at the end of the verse. The child left to himself brings his parents to shame. I'm paraphrasing. You leave the child to himself, you don't give him much instruction, you don't have much communication, it's going to bring shame to you as a parent. But the rod, the discipline, and instruction, you've got to do some communicating, brings wisdom to the child. You want your child to be wise? You've got to correct the wrong course at times. You've got to kind of guide them. You're on the wrong course, we got to come back and get over this way. And good communication makes that much easier. If you can't talk to your child when they're 5 and 10, it gets worse, you can just forget it by the time they're 16. It's over. You say, well, that's kind of a bleak picture. I'm sorry, it's just over. It's going to be over. If you can't talk to them at 10, you're not going to be able to correct their course at 16. It's just not going to work. So that's why we start early. All right, here's another value. Better relationships later in their life. As George mentioned this a moment ago, and so I said we'd come back to this. What's this about? Well, if communication is very poor while they're at home, it's not likely to improve when they leave home, I want to tell you. Probably not going to get any better. It's not as soon as they move out from home, they've suddenly got a wonderful relationship with the parents. It doesn't work that way. If it's sour here, it's going to be even more sour later. Probably not going to get any better. So, good communication is not just for the now. I want to communicate with my child at 10 years old. I want to communicate well with them and I want to instruct them. That's not just for when they're 10. That's for when you're getting old. You see, when you're in those retirement years and you need somebody to help you, you've now got a child you can communicate with. Make sense? And see the principle now coming alive. Train a child in the way, and when he is old, yeah. And when he's old, you may be even, and you will be even older and want communication with the child. Make sense? All right, I said we'd spend most of our time here, so let's go. Let's talk about some rules for effective communication. Why do I use the word effective? Because there is a sense, a loose sense of the word communicate. You lecture your child, I guess you're communicating. You kind of got my message across, I guess. You're hollering at your child, I guess you're communicating. Not effective. Why do I use the word effective?
There's better ways to communicate than others.
All right, there are better ways than others. Do you ever talk on this is worse years ago than it is now, back when we first got cell phone. Do you ever talk on a cell phone and you start a conversation and then you start hearing, Wait a minute, you kind of, something you broke, you're breaking up. Something, the signal was, something interfered with the signal. Does that make sense, what I'm talking about? And you tell them to repeat that. My point is, there are interferences sometimes we create in our communication with our children. Now, it's not the kind of static that we talked about with the telephone or the cell phone, but maybe it's something I'm doing that's creating that static. So let's list some things and let's see if we can get through these. And I believe we've got time. All right, here's some basic rules. It begins with mom and dad communicating with each other. And so why do we mention that? Well, good marriages make for good families. It's just impossible to say, we've got a great family. Oh, man, it's a wonderful family, but the marriage is sour. That don't work. It begins with mom and dad communicating. You can't be one with your mate without communication. By the way, one involves more than the intimate relationship. Some think it's limited to that. It's one in goals and purpose and aim, etc. And so you can't be united and be one with your mate without communication. So you're going to have to communicate with each other about how to communicate with your child. Would you agree with that? You know, do we need to tell our child this is wrong? Well, we got to talk and agree. We got to communicate with each other on that. And children are going to take note of this. They're smart enough. They'll see through all the veneer, and they will know if mom and dad are communicating effectively. I notice mom never answers dad. Dad kind of turns the cold shoulder to mom. I heard them hollering behind closed doors. They know. They're going to know for sure whether you're communicating well. And so you get your communication with your mate together before you start trying to communicate with your children. Make sense? Good place to start. Here's the second thing. Put yourself in their shoes. Why is that important? Understand their level. Ezekiel said he went down to the river and did what? Nobody knows? I sat where they sat. Very good. Yeah, I sat where they sat. In other words, he goes and sits with the people and comes to understand the people. And if you're going to teach people, forget teaching children, you're going to teach people, sit where they sit. See it from their eyes. See it from their vantage point. That gives us a better view of what needs to be said. For example, I'm trying to teach a denominationalist, and you say, well, just teach them the truth. Well, I might want to see it through their eyes that I'm trying to teach them something going against their family religion. Seeing it through that eye may help me to better know how to approach that. Does that make sense? All right. So I need to keep in mind the age and the maturity level of the child or the lack thereof. In other words, I'm not talking to a 5-year-old. I'm not talking to a 25-year-old adult. I need to understand I'm talking to a 5-year-old and not put things at the upper level. And so I want to treat them the way I want to be treated. So let's go to another principle. Put yourself in their shoes. Thirdly, be a good listener. What's involved in being a good listener? Listening.
Make the space to listen. Make the time.
Absolutely. Make the time, the opportunity, be a good listener. We're going to add more to that, and then we'll come back to what Melissa just said, the good point she just made. In other words, I need to listen to the child with the intent to understand the child. Here's a point I think adults get confused about, and it's so simple. But let's forget about children. Let's just talk about dealing with, for example, denominational error or whatever. There's a difference in understanding someone and agreeing with someone. I understand where the atheists are coming from. I just don't agree with them. I understand where the denominationalists are coming from. I don't agree with them, but I understand. Understanding is not agreement. So understanding your child, their complaint, their frustration, or whatever it is they're talking, listen with the intent to understand the child. See, the child needs to know that what they're saying to you, you think is important. It may be of little moment to you, but it's important to them. And they want you to think it's important. And so listen to the child. Colossians 3:21, what does it have to do with encouraging good listening? Fathers, children to wrath. Now, what does that have to do with being a good listener?
The rest of the verse is, lest they become discouraged. I mean, you listen to them, see what their point is.
All right. If I ignore the child and the child's trying to tell me something, trying to ask me something, then does that provoke them to wrath? Does that discourage them? Because every time I try to talk to dad or try to talk to mom, they kind of brush me off. Sure it does. Sure it does. That encourages being a good listener. I don't have time to develop from Romans 10, but if you want me to, I'll do that outside the class. Develop from Romans 10 and show that Romans 10 shows there's a difference in hearing and listening. Because Romans 10 shows the Jews heard the message, they just didn't listen to it. Your child heard every word you said, they didn't listen to it. There's a difference. Well, the same thing, you may hear your child yapping and talking, but you may not have listened to what your child said. So you want to communicate with your child? Start listening to them. Now, connected with that, and that's what Melissa just made a point, and I said I'd come back to, have good eye contact. Now, Webb mentions this in her book on page 272 following, if you want to go and look at the communication section. Excellent material there. Let the child know they're receiving all of your attention. Is that important? Absolutely. Have you ever talked to someone, forget your children for a moment, have you ever had a conversation with someone and they never look at you, they're looking at other things and all around, and that makes you think, they're not paying any attention to me. I'm talking to you.
And it makes you feel like you're unimportant.
Absolutely. Makes you, as the speaker, I must be unimportant because I'm here talking, trying to tell you something, and you're looking all around everywhere else. Well, the same thing is true with your child. They're trying to talk. Give them good eye contact. That might mean you put the phone down. Wish Charles was here. Remember his statement? I'd ask him to repeat it again. Put the phone down. That might mean turning the vacuum off, stopping the mixer, muting the TV, or stopping what you're doing and say, what is it that you have on your mind? That sends great signals to the child. Very important. All right, here's another. Be simple and clear. Would you agree with this? Sometimes the more we say, the less we accomplish. Is that true in preaching? No comments about how long the sermons are. What do you mean? That's true in preaching, isn't it? Yeah. I once had a Bible class where somebody went to help me, and you've heard me tell this story before. The question came up that could be simply, Daniel 2 mentions this. My helper spent 20 minutes giving the background to the book of Daniel, which you wouldn't understand if you didn't know the background of Jeremiah, which you wouldn't understand if you didn't know why they went into captivity. And we said so much, we destroyed the class and it was over, basically. Just ruined the class. The more we say, the less we may accomplish. So to a small child, something simple and clear like, that's great, or you did a good job, or I'm proud of you, may say more than if you had sat down and talked to them for 2 hours. I'm proud of you. You did a great job. And that kind of communication will encourage them to come back to you, show you more, and tell you more. Does that make sense? Simple stuff. This is very important. Make time, and this goes back to something Melissa said a moment ago. Make time for communication. Children will take note that you made time for them. You just didn't happen to have time. I've got a few minutes before I have to leave, or what is it you wanted? But I cleared some stuff. I quit some stuff. I turned some other people away so I could focus on you. You've heard me tell this before, but there were times back before cell phones and even before we had caller ID. Caller ID was around. We just didn't have it. I'd be in my office, and you'd have to answer the phone to see who it was. And one of my kids would be in the office talking to me, and I'd answer the phone, and I would say, can I call you back? I have someone in my office, and hang up. I didn't tell them I had one of my kids, but I want to tell you, their soul was just as important to me as that person who called about a Bible question, if not more important to me. In fact, it was more important to me. And I don't know if that made an impression on my kids, but hopefully your children will be impressed, and I think they were impressed with the fact that sometimes Dad just pushes other people aside to give me attention. That needs to be done. They'll take note of that. And as they grow, that time you need to spend with them may take longer at 16 than it did at 6. You got to make time for them. Mealtime, we've talked about, we had a whole lesson on that. It's a great time to communicate with you. Bedtime is a good time to assure them you love them and you care for them. Communicate with your children. Be honest. Why is that important? If they ever perceive you're not leveling with them, you've just destroyed their trust in you. Absolutely. You've shattered it. You've shattered it. So as parents, we need to learn to say, and if you've been a parent and raised your children, got children very old at all, you've had to say, I was wrong. I should not have done that. I overreacted to that. Or say, I don't know. I used to think my dad knew everything. And I got older and realized he didn't know everything. And I thought as I got to be a parent, I was going to have to know everything. They were like, I don't know everything. You don't know everything. Tell your children they don't know. And this is very important. When you make a promise to your child, keep it. You say you'll be there, be there. You say you will, you will. Clear everything else to do that. That has to do with honesty. Be careful of how you use the word no. Make no mean no. Not you keep asking and I'll finally give in and say yes. But I like what Webb says in that book, starting on page 272 and going forward for the next 20 pages or so. She makes this point, which I looked at a little bit and I thought, yeah, I think she's got a good point. Replace some of the no answers with alternative yes answers, and that is with what's permissible. In other words, don't fill your child's life with nothing but a bunch of no's, but the child says, I want a cookie. No, you can't have a cookie now, but you can have a piece of fruit. Give them an alternative. Or, no, you can't go watch TV again, but we can sit down and we'll read a book together. Give them some alternatives. Start early. I want to just mention a couple things, and I got one more point and we'll be done. What do we mean by early? The time to talk to them about marrying a Christian is not 18. It's too late. Start at 8. I don't mean 8 is the magic number. You might start at 6 or 7. But you start early. I started real early teaching our children before they could even fathom what marriage was about. When you grow up, you need to marry someone who fears God. And the time to teach them about the dangers of the denial of the Genesis record is not when they start high school, it's before they start grade school. If they're starting high school and you're just now getting to tell them about the dangers, forget it. Forget it. It's probably over. Start early. And then here's the last thing. Don't set the bar low by your comments. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, I borrowed this from this little book. Some of you have this. Some of you ladies studied this in a class called What Do You Communicate by Sandra Humphreys. If you have that, dig that book out. Look at page 45. You'll find some interesting comments. That the child is likely to accept the label that you give them. In other words, you tell other people, my child is clumsy. Well, the clumsiest thing I've ever seen. She points out and quotes from some psychologists that suggest you label them, they will adopt that and they think they're expected to be clumsy or stubborn. She makes the point that if you talk in front of the child about how they misbehave, they're going to think that's what my parents expect of me. My child just misbehaves every service and worship and just going to act up and is wiggly and squirmy, and they're going to think if you begin to tell that, that's what is expected. Mom and dad expect that of me. So don't set the bar low by the comments your children hear. Set the bar high. This is what is expected of you. You can do better. Make sense? All right. So, effective communication. Questions, comments. Time is gone. Here are our 17 lessons. We are done.